before we start, I want to make sure you understand today is the 15th day of the counting of the Omer. We're in the third week of this count, and we're dealing with Hesed Sheb Tiferet, which means kindness in harmony. That's the focus of today, from now until tomorrow afternoon. That's what we should be focusing on. Now, one of the things I'm not sure if you understand, we're only counting 49 days, and yet there's 50 days between Pesach and Shavuot. And the reason that there's only a 49-day count is because the first day is the day that they had the Passover meal, and they really didn't move. They hadn't left Egypt at that point. So the count actually begins with the exodus from Egypt and moving towards Mount Sinai. So I thought I'd share that with you in case you'd never seen anything like that before. So we're going to deal with the idea of how Tiferet kind of blends together, makes harmonious the ideas of Tiferet, which is really truth. And so we're going to be talking somewhat about that in the course of our subjects tonight. But tonight, we're really not going to spend time talking about the counting of the Omer. We're going to spend our night doing legalese. I find these 3 chapters, in fact, I was listening to a couple rabbis and they were excited by these chapters because there was so much legal understanding, so much that would require a law degree. In fact, one of the rabbis I like to listen to, Bereshit, try it again. He is a lawyer. And so this is his favorite time of year, just going through these 2 chapters. And so he spent a lot of time talking about all that's going on. But, when I went and thought about it, I realized, last week we talked about kashrut. We've talked about Shabbos. And we've talked about the idea of, God. They take up less verses than this section does. Cyrus takes up almost 100 verses. So there's a lot to it, except for the fact that we have to realize it doesn't exist today. In fact, according to most understandings, Cyrus disappeared about 270 years before the temple was destroyed, the second temple. Telling us probably more than what we want to know is that the world was changing, and so was Israel. The Cohens weren't there that they needed to call on, and the righteous people were not as righteous as they had been. And I guess if I was going to make a comparison, I'd compare it to Noah. Remember, Noah was righteous in his generation, but compared to Abraham, would not have been so. And so as we're looking at what's going on, this idea of Cyrus, and I use the S sound as opposed to the T sound. I'm doing Sephardic as opposed to Ashkenazic. But the understanding is the fact that this illness that God knows will diminish takes so much of the chapter that I had to ask myself the question, why? Why are we spending this much time dealing with this subject? And then we have another section called Metzora, which is dealing with the person who develops Osiris. So it's one of those things that seems rather strange until one realizes that everything in the Bible, everything in the Torah, was not meant to be something that we could just gloss over, that we really had to go down into the text. And that's what they wanted. God wants us to go down into the text, to really dig and to understand what's going on. Now, I want you to look at 13:2. We're not going to spend much time doing all around the Bible, but this verse really is important because it begins, if a person will have on their skin of his flesh a seats, saphakos, a banneret, or you will become Cyrus, an affliction of the skin of his flesh, and he shall be brought to Aaron the Cohen, or to one of his sons, the Kohanim. The word that I want you to focus on is if a person. You see, that's an English translation of a very key word, and that word is Adam. in the Bible, there are 4 names given to man. The highest of these 4 is the name Adam. It's the one that's associated with the righteous. That is the most clarifying idea I can come up with. And Adam was a tzaddik in those days. He studied, he found himself purifying himself, reaching the point of being what we would call perfect. Now, he was never perfect, but he was reaching that goal. In other words, he had begun to change himself completely. Now, in going through this complete change, Rabbi Zolman, who was the first of the Chabad rabbis, talked about the fact that this ailment affected only their skin, never anything deeper than that, only the skin. And because it only affected the skin and the fact that it wasn't internal, talked about the fact of how perfect the man or woman was becoming, because it was only skin deep. In other words, it was our surface that had to be cleaned up. That's the reason that Cyrus was given to these people. For even one of such a lofty level at times needed to be refined, as the more I think about it. Now, skin deep, that becomes important to me. And the fact is that since it is skin deep, doctors have tried to identify it as well, first off, they called it leprosy, which we know this isn't leprosy. It's an entirely different thing altogether. In fact, the word leprosy showed up after the Greek Septuagint Bible was created. Because you see, in the Greek Septuagint Bible, the Greeks called it lepra, L-E-P-R-A. And soon it became known as leprosy. But it wasn't leprosy, because it was not a physical disease that they carried, yet it had physical signs. It was not physical, it was all spiritual. That was the focus behind it. Only the righteous, the most righteous, received this. And so it became very interesting to me when I began to look at the characters, and I had to reevaluate the characters that have had it. Now, we know in the Tanakh or in the Torah that Moses and Miriam both had it. Moses got it when he was at the burning bush, and God used it as one of the 2 signs to explain, your mission. These are 2 ways that you can know. Miriam received it, remember, when she questioned why Moses wasn't spending more time with his Ethiopian wife. But there were other characters who received it, and those were in the regular stories. I find it interesting that 2 kings actually had the disease. Uzziah and Azariah both had that disease. Uzziah received the disease. In fact, Uzziah was one of the great kings up until the point in time in which he decided that he was going to go into the Holy of Holies, or into the holy place, and place an offering, thinking that he was a priest, when in actuality he wasn't. So he received it. And so he spent the last 13 years of his life in a graveyard where he established his home. So for 13 years, he lived with this. Now, we know Moses didn't live with it. It was only a temporary. We know Miriam only had it for 7 days. But Uzziah had it for years. He wasn't the only one. Remember, Elisha had a servant, Gehazi, who decided that he was going to tell Naaman, who had leprosy. And that's interesting because he's the only non-Jew to have it. And remember, he was a general in the Aramean army. So what kind of character did this man actually have that he would end up with Cyrus? Well, that's not the only ones. We know that there were 4 men who had Cyrus who went into Sennacherib's camp after God destroyed the Aramean army and saved Jerusalem. So there were lots of characters in the Bible that had the disease. And we don't normally think of the 4, or we don't think of Gehazi or even Naaman as being perfect or near perfect. they received the disease, which is only given to those who are that close. So I began to think about it. Now, the Kabbalists explain that Cyrus itself actually comes from a very lofty, sublime source. It wasn't that Cyrus itself that made the person impure. It was the declaration that did it. In other words, God demonstrated on their physical being that these people were near perfect. That is not something that you would normally wear a color on your chest or a scarlet letter on your chest. But God used it to identify these people and to cause them to change, repent, if you will. Now, in the process, each of those, when they had it, had to call on the Cohen. Now, in the beginning, it was Aaron. Then it became Aaron's sons, and then it became sons of Aaron. As we go through, we understand that by the days of Samuel, remember Samuel was the Cohen, Eli, was the Cohen, Eli was the Cohen at that time, and his two sons were far from perfect. And so Samuel at that point in time stepped in to become what we would have called the high priest. So the characters themselves began to do what's called in Hebrew, Yored Toledot, the descending of generations, until finally Cyrus disappears. Now, in understanding this, we also have to understand that Cyrus is also a judgment. Hard to imagine that you're judging perfect people, but again, their perfection was so great that God was interested in even the flaw and changing that and making it what he could. So think about it in those terms. Now, this person, remember, the first thing that happens to them after they've been identified, remember they go to the Cohen for that. After they've been identified, they're put in seclusion, separated out, taken away from everybody. Now, I have to also imagine, or have to understand, as I shared in that verse, that second verse, there are 4 different kinds of Cyrus. Each kind, well, according to Rambam, there was no difference in each kind. The only difference was in the color of each one of them. One was a snow white, one was a white as wool, one was white as plaster, one was white as eggshell. That was their color differences. And so if a person had a mark on their hand that was declared to be Cyrus, the high priest or the Cohen had to identify exactly which one of the 4 he had. It wasn't a question of the fact, yeah, oh yeah, you got it. He had to be able to name it. And so he had to know it so well. And again, understanding that he was acting in the place of a judge. Now, there were times when he couldn't decide. And when he couldn't decide, there was something that had to be done. So what did he do? He said, time out, 7 days outside the camp and come back, and I'll come and see you in 7 days. So the man was placed outside the camp with this, what appeared to be a spiritual disease. He's not contagious, but he's separated. Now, we would see that as being rather, well, it's not right. But the answer is it was absolutely right, because what happened during those 7 days was the reflection time between the man or woman and God. They simply were about the idea of here's intimate time with him. So that seemed to be the process that we went through. Now, after 7 days, the Cohen would go out into the fields where he was. He would look at the spot again. If the spot hadn't changed and hadn't grown, he would say another 7. Well, actually, it was only 6 because that day would have counted as 1. So he started over again. So a man could be, or a woman could spend possibly 13 days in isolation without showing any change or sign that would have told us that we could no longer consider them pure or clean, but we couldn't consider them unclean. Now, I kind of, as I'm going through this, I begin to think about the fact that, we looked at it as a physical disease. In fact, I looked at it as a physical disease for far too long, even though I knew it wasn't. When I used the word leprosy, that was the first thing that came to my mind. And I did not use the correct word. I didn't use the word Cyrus. And that's an important thing to do. When you're thinking about this and you're reading an English or Christian Bible, you won't see Cyrus. You'll see leprosy. And so it changes or taints the way you look at things. And I want you to understand as we're going through this, make sure you understand it had physical symptom, but it was a spiritual mark. A spiritual mark. Cyrus was also a mini prophecy, according to Rambam. He said, by that simple mark on his being or her being caused them to again understand their relationship with God and their closeness to God. What is it that they needed to do in order to reach perfection? That's something that we oftentimes have to analyze. What do we have to do different to become better? And so that was the same thing that these people were doing for, up to 13 days in their isolation. And if it was found that that had grown, at that point, they were now declared impure and they were now kept out of the camp. After 13 days, if they couldn't decide, they were given permission to re-enter the camp and they were declared to be clean, even though they still had the mark on them, but it hadn't changed in any way, shape, or form. So we have this mini prophecy that's supposed to help us in understanding what's going on. Now, again, this Cyrus was kind of like manna. I made the comparison because of the fact that manna was distributed by the purity of the person. The more pure you were, the less distance you had to travel from your dwelling in order to gather all the manna that you needed for yourself. And if you were not so pure, you would go great distances looking for the manna. All as a way to tell us where we are in relationship to God. I found it interesting when I started to think about it. I said to myself, well, if I look outside my tent and I don't see anything right away, I'll look over at my neighbor's tent, because if they're better, I'll just go over and borrow his, and then he can go find some himself. But the answer was, according to the rabbis, they couldn't see anybody else's manna. So when they went looking for manna, it was only because that was the only place that they could find it. They couldn't find it at their neighbor's tent or their next door neighbor's tent or anybody else's. Over and over again, it was a process that they would go through. And so the idea of Cyrus is the same thing. It's an idea of purity and becoming pure. Now, normally, we think of Cyrus as in regards to the skin, in regards to the idea of, Lashon Hora, the evil tongue, the jealous tongue, the whatever you want to use, the embezzling tongue. It's the idea that the tongue is not true. And so the skin represented that external idea. But sometimes it wasn't just on the skin, it was on the clothing. Now, on the clothing, one could simply cut the patch out and replace it. But if it was on that cloth, the patch would regrow the sarats. And so it became impossible to do anything. So the the coat had to be thrown away. But even then, that was an outward sign. Another sign was if it was on the walls of your house or on any of your property. Now, if it was on the clothing, they understood it to be about arrogance. One became so arrogant that their clothing I guess I would have put it on Korach. Because remember, Korach ends up making all those blue talits in order to show his wealth and his arrogance. On the wall, they talk about it showing the idea of pleasure. In other words, I spend more time pleasing myself than I do pleasing God. And so those were the three major ways in which it was identified and dealt with in its particular case. But in any case, isolation was the requirement for somebody who had sarats either on himself or herself, on their clothing, or on their walls. Now, there were cases where the sarats was on the walls as they came into the land of at that time, Canaan. And there was situations where the walls were marked with leprosy so that the people there would tear down the walls, because if a house became leprous, became sarat, they tore down the walls. And in this case, as they're tearing down, many found wealth or riches that had been hidden into the walls. And so therefore it was actually a blessing, a prophetic blessing of sorts. Now, Rashi would talk about it. In fact, I want to quote Rashi here. Because with his evil speech, he separated man from his wife, one person from the other, so he will be separated. Being alone in this case was a punishment considered to be measure for measure. This afflicted person had a serious problem. The Hebrew word, now this is extra, the Hebrew word that we're going to use for affliction is the word nega. Nega is spelled N or Nun, Gimel, Ein. Now, there was another way in which one would develop saras. That was through an inappropriate touch. In fact, that word is naga, Nun, Gimel, Ein. The exact same letters. The only difference is the vowel punctuation. So sarats dealt with both the mouth and the inappropriate touch. Those were the things that were going on. So as we're going through this, it brought to mind Balaam. You remember Balaam was standing on the mountain looking down over Israel, getting ready to make his third prophetic message, trying to curse them when he couldn't. And in that third message, he simply said, a nation that dwells alone. You see, in actuality, psychologically, we have made Israel to stand alone. I'm not talking about you or I. I'm just talking about nations in general. The Jewish people are left to stand alone. In other words, they hold what we would call sarats. There's purity in their people, but at the same point in time, they're being punished. Now, when we talk about this, we also have to talk about the character, the man or the woman, and what they're called. And the word for that is metzora. So they were unrectified. That's the concept behind this whole thing, is the fact that they're unrectified. And so this whole process is about the rectification of a person. Now, if Zarets was suspicioned on a person, he was segregated, which I said. And now at the end of this whole thing, the person would be healed. But what was involved in the process of the healing, in other words, have they been declared clean, they had to bring 3 offerings to the tent in order to satisfy the cleansing that was being done. Now, according to the story, the first offering that they had they had 3 days that they were going to be bringing offerings, 3 separate times. The first offering that they're going to bring is called the guilt offering, because they were guilty of a sin, whatever that sin was, by mouth or by touch. The second offering that they had to bring was an offering that was designed for the sin offering. The sin offering, again, for the excuse of that which you've done. Now, the third offering was the burnt offering, the whole offering that they're going to be giving. So these 3 offerings are going to be given over the course of this whole 3-day period. Now, the problem that the poor faced, and many times the one who had developed SARS was not the richest person in the world. In fact, many of them were impoverished. If I go back to the writings in the Talmud, one of the things that they had to do was they had to be, no matter what they had done or no matter who they were, their first offering had to be a sheep, involving them to spend a lot of time collecting money from people who are willing to give, because that had to be the first offering that they made. After that, they could give the 2 turtle doves or whatever other small offering, the meal offering. But the first offering had to be a sheep. That had to happen that way. And the reason is they were to be indebted. They were indebted to God. And so in this process, God had demanded certain things. And the first thing he had demanded was a sheep. So they had to supply the sheep in order to go on. And again, as we're going through this, Rambam said there was no such difference between any of the diseases. The only difference was how Cohen reacted to the disease itself, whether he saw it as a disease. All of this is theoretical because we haven't had anyone develop Cyrus. Yeah, there's people with leprosy, and leprosy is fatal, but Cyrus is not existent. But yet it is something that we have to spend time, like this week, studying about and thinking about. It's the idea of appraising and seeing if there's an application that's found within the text. What can we find that we hadn't found before? What is the text really trying to get across? Now, we can understand that the Torah is all about general learning. That's a given. But how often, and this is my second real engagement in these 2 chapters, I have to admit that these are not the most fun chapters for me to do, because it doesn't seem to have practical application today. But there must be something in there that I still have got to go back and dig through. And so I'm not done going through them, but I'm done at this point trying to understand what I know at this point. So Cyrus then is something that we're going to have to deal with, because if you didn't know it before, please understand the Mashiach will be said to have leprosy or had Cyrus. Excuse my Christianese. But the Messiah will actually have it. Now, last week I told you about the fact that the Messiah would come with the fall of the third gate. I told you that the third gate was the red gate, which was from Russia. That was an understanding that the Kabbalists have. And so Moscow, which is red, the gates fell in Moscow. And so that was the third gate that fell. When did it fall? I don't know. The rabbis never said. They just simply said that the third gate had fallen. So as we're going through this, we're talking about the rectification, all of those cases that are going on. So Metzora is about Motzi Shem Ra, one who is guilty of slander. Metzora, Motzi Shem Ra. Now, doctors are still trying to make this disease into something that people can get or are having now. They're still wanting to call it leprosy. In Greek, the closest thing that we can to the word, again, comes from the word lepra, is the idea of psoriasis, because you see that's what lepra is, psoriasis. That's the closest disease that we can come up with that goes to dealing with this idea. I really don't have any more. If you have questions or concerns or something else you want to talk about that comes from the chapters or another chapter, have at it. But hopefully I gave you something to think about.